come up with a Jeff Lucas disclaimer. So I'm going to announce that before we start, like each reading of each chapter type of thing. So I'll read my Jeff Lucas disclaimer, and then we can kind of start talking about different things. But we are all not attorneys on here, although there may be some on here, which I know Nettleman is. And everything discussed is just personal opinions and may not stand up in court. Our hope is that we can open the discussions up to a broader audience and have these ideas recorded for the next generation. I know there are some great high-profile boundary surveyors on here, and there are even some college students from across the country on this Zoom meeting, and I hope that we can all gain a bit of knowledge from these discussions. And so my Jeff Lucas disclaimer, take it as you will. But honestly, it's this is something that, I wanted to start last year. Connie had been throwing it out on Facebook for quite some time as well, trying to get a book club going. I loved one of the comments the other day was, I thought book club, you're not supposed to talk about book club. That was a good one. That was such a good one. So I laugh on that. And then when it comes time for kind of just discussions, we'll just do the whole raise your hand feature, and then we'll just kind of call on people as we go. Rather, that way we don't talk over each other. And then Nettleman is obviously one of the contributing authors to the latest edition of Evidence and Procedure. So I asked Tony to kind of jump on tonight, and if he can provide any insight on the latest edition, and he had some discussion topics that he can go over, and then Trent was going to kind of lead the discussion with some talking points from there. I do have I can share the screen because I did buy the ebook part of it as well. So I have that. I can kind of, as we hit certain talking points, I can kind of go over it on the introduction side of things as well. So, oops, I don't think I shared my screen. I was trying to share my screen, and there we go. So we have this as well to kind of just highlight and go over as we talk about different things. So I will turn it over to Dr. Nettleman and let him kind of just go over the purposes of the original intent of Evidence and Procedures, because there is, like you talked about, different Browns and different books. So I'll turn it over to Nettleman, and then we'll kind of get going.
Well, first of all, let's all thank Trent for just a minute for doing this. Rarely do we have people do things out of the kindness of their heart versus, some kind of ulterior motive. And, this is a surveyor versus an attorney. Was the attorney would try to think of somebody to monetize this, or, sell a book, or here's an Amazon link to purchase. But, Trent has really, put on Mentoring Mondays, and now this book club, which is great. So, for a minute, take a second and thank Trent for sure.
Thank you, sir.
When I grew up with Evidence Procedure, Browns, Clark, and I always saw Walt editing this book, year after year. And the one consistent thing was that Walt and Don were always late. I mean, it could have been like 3 months past due, or 5 months past due, or 7 months past due. But I guess as a kid, I didn't really appreciate, what the purpose of the books were, how they worked. I just saw him, typing away. And even when I worked with Walt, I didn't quite understand the differences between these books. And it's great because now that I've become a co-author of Evidence and Procedure, Browns, now I've taken over Clark, I really appreciate the differences between these books. And I thought for a minute it would be good just to, to lead with that. So, Evidence and Procedure is really about not the principles of every boundary location, not the principles of all surveying or whatever. Evidence and Procedures is really about the evidence, the parole testimony, the original evidence, the surveys, the deeds, the patents, everything you collect as evidence as a surveyor. Because I've taken a lot of these surveying exams, and they all talk about original evidence, but what is the likelihood of finding an original corner, or all of the original corners? Pretty much zero, unless you're in a brand new subdivision. And then a lot of times the new subdivision surveyors will be like, oh, we set all these corners, and you can't find a single iron rod in a 400 lot survey. So Evidence and Procedure is about, what do you do once the original evidence is not found? How do you weigh all of the secondary evidence? What do you hold? What do you not hold? How do you perform the analysis of the retracement? And what tools are available to do the analysis? And a lot of times, even after how many hundreds of expert witness cases, I'm still, mentally, logically reasoning through all of this torrential downpour of stuff. You've got pipes, you've got iron rods, you've got fences, you've got deeds, patents, you've got original abstracts in Texas. All of this stuff provides some kind of evidence to kind of tilt the scales one way or the other. So we've got to really look at what we have and figure out what is a higher priority than the other evidence. And then, which is really exciting, you have to explain your methodology, your results, your data to non-surveyors every day. So you have to kind of, take it in, bite-sized pieces and logically explain every step of the survey. And I really hope that evidence and procedures will help you guys as surveyors go through that, the mental gymnasium of weighing evidence and make better decisions.
Yeah, that's awesome. I appreciate the kind of the background and the history behind those, and that's good stuff. What was your Trent? You have so Trent Williams joined me at the Western Conference and was like, when we talked about it, he's like, I'm helping wherever you can help. So that's why I kind of let Trent lead the discussions on some of his talking points. But hopefully everybody's kind of read that first introduction chapter. Again, the plan was to go the second and fourth Tuesday of every month. So you got some time to read between weeks. But what's kind of your first talking point you got, Trent?
Well, let's do this to kind of get us started. Let's set some ground rules a little bit, and then let's kind of, if you can in the chat, let's throw in like the challenge with Zoom is with the roundtable, we're going to all want to talk over each other. We all have some ideas that have come with it. There's things that I've written down that I don't 100% agree with the book, or would do a little differently, or would want to discuss and get opinions. So let's do this. Everyone, why don't you jump in the chat if you've got a question or a talking point, or just something that stuck out to you, like I learned something new out of this. Why don't we throw those into the chat real fast, so we can kind of have a list of things we can hit. We make sure we hit discussion points. Younger surveyors, newer surveyors, if there's things that just didn't make sense, throw that out there.
Yeah.
And our more experienced surveyors, if there's something that, an example or something like that, let's throw a bunch of stuff in the chat here real fast, just so we can see kind of where we're at for a roundtable discussion. Make sure to hit the right talking point. How does that sound?
Yeah, that's perfect. And I think, this first part, right, just kind of the introduction, the background of it, that kind of stuff, may not get into the super meat and potatoes until we, start getting into chapter 2, 3, 4, and that. So obviously this first meeting, just kind of being the overview and the introduction portion of it, we may not hit the meat and potatoes of stuff, but it's a good.
Absolutely. I just don't want to be the Trent book report. So
right there you go.
let's pull some people in. If you've got something to discuss, let's get that posted up there. And then maybe if you're using a different version, just out of curiosity, throw out what version you're using. If you didn't go out and buy the 7th one, didn't get it in yet. We got a couple 5th editions. I started. This is a little intimidating for me because we got John Stahl on here. I'm out of Utah, and I took Boundary Law 1 and 2 from John Stahl, and so now I've got a mentor here, a great surveyor that taught me, and now he's going to join this discussion, and that's a little intimidating for me. So we got 5th editions from school, a lot of 5th editions from school, a couple 6th editions.
Yeah, just to jump in there, being as you called me out. Yeah, I've been teaching a boundary law class out of these books. In fact, when I went to school, back in the 70s, we learned how to, out of editions 3 and 4 for boundary control legal principles, evidence procedures. And I've been teaching now boundary law class since 1991. So going on 31 years of just adjunct teaching of these classes using these textbooks. And like you say, there's some stuff in there that you disagree with. There's stuff that you agree with, but for a launch off point, there's no better textbooks on the market. It's encouraging. I was really excited to be able to join in on this discussion and really see, after seeing the same thing over and over and seeing from my own perspective, it's really going to be a great opportunity for me, I think, to see others' perspectives on the same material, and hopefully can glean a whole different outlook or viewpoints of the material. It's like I say, it's a great set of books,
Yeah.
and there's been a lot of changes over the years, some good, some not so good, but I think it anytime there's changes and new editions that come out, it's worthwhile to go back and look at what changes have been made, what's the reason for those changes, and how will those changes impact what I'm doing as a surveyor on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, that's awesome. And of course, the standard, right? Case law changes everything almost every day. Hey, Tony, I don't know if you saw Dr. Piva's question, but he wanted to know how come Brown was dropped.
Yeah, it's a great question. Brown really has not contributed to evidence and procedure for a long time. It's been Walt and Don for, I don't know, as long as I've been alive. So we kept Brown in there for several editions just as a remembrance of his work. But really, the book has gone way beyond what, Brown contributed. So we figured 3 authors is enough.
Got it. Perfect.
That's a good question, though.
Yeah, of course. Everybody wants to know why, right? I mean, it's how it started.
And the other weird thing is, I took over Clark on Surveying this edition, and they kept Walt's name on the front cover only. And then they put my name as the real author on the first page. So Walt's not doing it. And I said, well, why is that? Well, and Wiley said, well, we let the old authors be on the cover for 2 or 3 editions because we don't want to lose any sales from attorneys when they were selling these. Typical Wiley, right? It's all about the
units sold. That's awesome.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna start the discussion then just a little bit on what John Stahl talked about.
Yeah,
it's the changes, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
The changes in surveying. So I'm 37. I've been surveying for over 20 years. I started right out of high school as a drafter in surveying. And so while I'm half the age of the average surveyor, I've got some experience behind me. I spent most of my time in the residential design type surveying, just your standard subdivisions. In Utah, we deal with old Pioneer lot and block. So I have some of that experience. But I did spend some time for a utility surveying and engineering company and did a lot of right-of-way surveys. So got a little bit of experience that kind of touches everything. But when I started out, it was, for our company, GPS was new, right? And then, we moved into a GPS, and now, companies are using drones, scanners, ground penetrating radar. I mean, the way we look for evidence of these corners has changed drastically, just even in my time. Just kind of starting out on the introduction here. I'm going to read a paragraph. This is under 1.1. It's the 4th paragraph. Just kind of start the discussion. Let's get some thoughts here. The function of land surveyor should be considered as varied and different in each state. For simplicity, boundary surveying can be divided into 2 general areas or disciplines: locating or relocating originally described parcels of land, and creating new parcels. In keeping with recent legal decisions, we have somewhat modified some of the terminology. For instance, seldom is the term property line or property boundary used. It is our belief that property rights, including property boundaries, are legal questions and as such are not addressed by land surveyors. The surveyors locate boundaries or land boundaries or deeds, and they do not and cannot locate property rights. And then it kind of continues to talk about locating corners, locating the boundaries here. And this is the first one I think we can get into a lot of really great discussion on, is what is surveying. So as we read through this first chapter, those that were able to, if you have something to contribute, go ahead and raise your hand so we can make sure everyone kind of gets recognized. But I don't want to get everyone's thoughts, because state to state it's a little different, but I'm going to throw out a really wild opinion here, is why I generally agree with the statement that we don't locate rights, we locate boundaries. We put that boundary on the ground. 9 times out of 10, the general public relies on us to locate the extents of rights, even though we may not necessarily be defining or locating those. It's a fine distinction between the two. So I'm going to throw that out here to the group. That is kind of the first thing that popped out to me is, what do you think? Are we just throwing lines on the ground, or are we locating something more? And where does our professional liability begin or end?
That goes back to Lucas's thing, right? Deed staker or, helper, and help define the property rights and that kind of stuff. So I love that.
Yep.
Anybody, nobody's kind of unchiming, but if you guys want to raise your hand, you can chime in. And it's supposed to be a roundtable discussion, people.
I'm just going to start going down a list and calling people. If I don't know your name,
there you go. Dr. Paiva.
Talk now. Joseph, go ahead.
Everybody, good to see everybody here, and I'm shocked to see how many people are participating. So
I love it. Yeah.
I hope it keeps growing. And you should have advertised that one of the authors would be in on the call, Trent. That might have really helped. What I was going to say, I was actually starting to type it in chat, is that when I teach my classes, I have used this terminology. You're not staking out a property boundary. So don't go out in the field, put a stake in the ground, an iron in the ground, and then tell everybody in the vicinity, this is the property boundary. Because all kinds of things could have happened. And most of these people in my classes work for surveying organizations already. As most of you know, surveying is a late vocation for most people. So that's kind of a common thing, at least in my world. And what I find is that they really push back hard, because I hear about it from their bosses. What the hell are you teaching these guys? Of course, we stake out property corners and those kinds of things. And trying to get people in the profession, I'm so glad that I'm able to talk to people who are entering the profession, because most of them are candidates for licensure, that they're starting to think about this and to parse those terms, because they tend in common practice in their jobs to use all these terms not simultaneously. There's another word that's not coming to mind. And so interchangeably. And so I'm very happy. I don't know if you had any role in that, Tony, because I don't use evidence and procedures as a text, but I do use the other one. And as you know, that same proposition is put out there on this thing about, are you staking out boundary lines or deed lines and property lines? And I keep telling the students, this is a fluid thing. It depends on the survey you're doing, what the circumstances are, because you might sometimes be actually able to state what it is the way you're used to stating it, but you shouldn't use these terms interchangeably. So I'm glad that you bring that out. I haven't read this particular edition. I have it on order. I should be getting it Monday, but I'm curious to see if that premise that you cover there in that paragraph continues through the entire book, and maybe you can tell us.
Yeah, it's a great point, and I think it does, because the way I think about, finding a property boundary is really kind of peeling back layers of an onion. You start with a deed, but there could be other deeds that overlap, or there could be other patents. And then you've got, these defenses, affirmative defenses like prescription, estoppel, latches, or could be adverse possession, all kinds of things that could affect the property ownership irrespective of what the deed says. And I guess I've never worked with I've only worked with very astute attorneys, luckily, or at least somewhat astute attorneys. So they kind of get this. But I know a lot of surveyors where the client says, I just want what's in my deed. I just want what's in my deed. And those are the kind of people who will probably drive you out of your mind. And also remember, if you as a surveyor are trying to offer opinions about property rights, that's really more of a real property attorney's wheelhouse, you could be opening yourself up to some very, very serious liability. I had a surveyor do an Alta survey, and the title company gave him a title report about 1,000 pages long for a commercial building. And there was one page missing. It was a second page of easement. So one page said building A gets to use building B's parking lot. But the second missing page said building B got a reciprocal agreement to use building A. Well, they sued the surveyor and said, you should have caught this. You should have done your own title search and confirmed the validity. And I said, Now, thank God the surveyor didn't get held liable. It was like $20 million damages. This was like a 2,000 unit parking lot on this huge building. But, imagine if the surveyor's job was to provide title opinions, all the extra dangers in that.
Well, let me throw this out here then, to my original point is, I always throw the disclaimer out anytime I'm doing a property survey, and I'm dealing with one here locally. And I want to get into this a little bit because the laws surrounding boundary line agreements and boundary adjustments are being convoluted in Utah because someone thought they were smarter than the average surveyor and title company and tried to put some language. They screwed it all up, long story short. But, I'm dealing with something that would be a clear boundary line agreement, right? The deeds don't fit occupation, and there's confusion in the title, those type of things. But so I throw this out there anytime I'm with this type of client or any of my surveys. I said, look, I'm a surveyor. Properties are one big giant jigsaw puzzle, right? And we're going to sit here and we're going to just keep jamming pieces into the jigsaw puzzle till the picture makes sense. Right. But I always share that this is my opinion of where this property line is based off of here's the things I found, your deed, the fence, the, whatever, the easements, the occupation, and so I try and protect myself in the real discussion about that, right? And show that I'm not talking about rights. I'm talking about a location of the document on the ground. But I'm pretty confident in all disclaimers I can put in. Joe Public is still taking my word as a professionally licensed surveyor and assuming everything that Tony just kind of warned us against, right?
Yeah, exactly. Go ahead, Dr. Parva. You had your hand back up.
Yeah, I didn't want to assume I had the floor. I'll just throw out a comment and then leave time for other people. But what Tony pointed out, your legal exposure, whether you go to court or not, is something that I think we need to always keep in mind, because the thing that some of my students will bring up, or even other surveyors, they'll say, well, how does the realtor get away with telling their client, oh, your boundary line is where the telephone line is back there in your backyard, and they get away with it? I tell them actually that they could be charged with something, but I don't know that courts would go along with it. But surveyors need to realize that the words they use are treated, because they are professionals in this area, with a lot of with a lot of gravity. And so being careful about not using the wrong word is a really important thing as part of your professional practice.
Yeah. And, it goes back to, I mean, just public perception as well. I mean, they rely on us because we're professional boundary, surveyors. And so that's what they rely upon. But that's all the public knows, is we're supposed to tell them where their boundary is. They don't necessarily understand the legal side of things, right? And the liability side of things. And that's, from the surveyor side of things, the surveyor is always trying to find every way to limit their exposure and their liability. And we've even had Dr. Nelman on doing a Mentoring Mondays on how to limit your liability and your exposures and stuff. So it's such a catch-22 of, doing things right, but enough disclaimers to protect yourself. So
Make an opinion without ever actually making an
Yeah.
opinion about anything.
surveyors are great at that.
So Connie, you threw there in the chat,
Yeah.
the discussion of the difference between the two is difficult to explain to surveyors, never mind lay people. Do you want to talk a little bit about maybe your approach to that and some thoughts?
Well, for example, I worked in a large engineering company which deals with capital improvements project, and then down to subdivisions. So we don't do a lot of single lot surveys, but throughout all these large planning projects, whenever we're dealing with starting with municipalities to even to sophisticated land developers, we are always faced with a question: who owns this? Who owns this? Who owns this? And it's a tightrope walk between trying to explain to them, look, we can help with entitlements, we can plot where certain things are. I can't really tell you who owns certain things. I could point you to the title company and see if they're going to vouch for who owns certain areas. I can just, I know just enough to let you know that I can't explain this, that we need to pass this information on to a title expert, whether that be a land attorney or a title company or somebody who is actually an expert in that. So this is a daily occurrence in what I do.
Some interesting topics here, some thoughts. How about any of our younger surveyors? Do you guys want to throw in any questions? Is this making sense? Again, like Connie said, this is a difficult thing for most surveyors to even grasp sometimes. I just want to make sure some of our younger ones are kind of grasping what we're discussing here, if they have any questions.
Yeah.
Great question, Tony.
Yeah,
Yes. Who here authors a survey report to go along with their maps? I always have a surveyor's narrative on my maps. Sometimes that's pretty simple as far as, look, I opened the subdivision plat and I found rivets and I went with it and I'm good. And sometimes it's, a list of 8 surveys I used and why I held one versus the other and try and explain my logic. Survey notes and survey notes and boundary notes are a must.
Yeah. One of the things I like to tell everybody that, who makes a map for us, at least at my company, is it must be defendable when it walks out the door. It has to be from the face of the map by itself. It must be defendable. You must be able to look at it and know either like how you retraced it or why you accepted certain things or whatever. So those are like kind of the lines that I like to use. John, you had your hand up. Did you want to still chime in or no? Maybe. Yeah.
Sure. I kind of take a little bit of a different perspective on this. You know, the boundary control legal principles, evidence procedures books were written, and we'll see that here in a little bit, where they were started to be written back in the 50s, the 60s, and have gone through recent, more recent updates throughout the years. But in the late 90s, there was actually a very big change that came about in the legal side of the profession, where the rules of evidence and the rules of civil procedure were adopted or completely rewritten and adopted in a nationwide effort. Some of the states still have yet to adopt some of the procedures and such, but through the adoption of those of the rules of evidence in particular, there was always a question in the courts whether or not a professional could express an opinion on what was called the ultimate issue. Well, the ultimate issue in any kind of a boundary case is, where's the boundary? And the courts would prohibit the surveyor from he could lay out the evidence he's used and say, here's what my findings are, but could never really say why or explain how the law was applied to the evidence and how they actually arrived at their determination. Once that rule has taken effect now, it actually says that we can express our professional opinion as to that ultimate issue. And I've been in courts multiple times, testifying as an expert witness. And every case that I'm involved in, that is the ultimate question. And they'll ask me, then in your professional opinion, where is the boundary? And I'll begin to say it, and then immediately the other side will object because, oh no, that goes to the ultimate issue. And they argue it back and forth, and it comes out that, well, no, the rules of evidence say he can express an opinion, and you do it. So I think there was this big transition that happened through those rules of civil procedure, the rules of evidence, have really kind of changed that thinking quite a bit, and opened the door for surveyors to actually make determination of the boundary locations. Now, I appreciate the difference, though, and we have to really understand the difference between, like Joseph was saying, the difference between title issues and boundary location. We as surveyors are licensed to determine the location of the boundary, and we don't have to express any opinion on who owns it, or we don't even have to know who owns it, except for maybe if you want to file a lien against the property for non-payment of your services. It's nice to know who owns the property. But even then, when it comes down to ownership, who owns it, the laws provide an easy answer, and that is whoever's getting the tax assessment notice mailed to them by the assessor's office is presumed to be the owner. And I don't have to prove it. It's a presumption of law. If I can, and anybody can look that up. You don't have to be an expert to figure that out. However, the recommendation is send them to a title company. Fantastic. Let the title company deal with who owns and who has what rights to what. But I can still tell them, here's where the boundary is. And in my professional opinion, that's where it's at. And then speaking back again to Trent Williams' comment about Utah's wrangling with evidence of the boundary adjustment and boundary agreement process. As of May 4th, we got part of it fixed through our legislative session this year, where we now have defined boundary agreements quite well in our statutes, and surveyors. As surveyors in Utah, that's an excellent tool that we have when we get these crazy, messed up boundaries and ambiguities and uncertainties and disputes between neighbors, to just get them together and say, where do you want the boundary? Settle this dispute, here's where it is. And then it gives the surveyor a tool to document that agreement, get that agreement in writing. Well, then we all know where the boundary is. It's right where they agreed it to be. So it takes all of those real complex issues and boils them down to a simple solution that you can document and finish your survey, show where it's at, and it becomes an original survey of that agreed boundary.
I was gonna say parole evidence at its best right there.
Yeah, it's an affidavit between both adjoining landowners that here's where our boundary is. Who
Yeah.
might have said that they're wrong?
Yeah, that's fantastic. I love that. I know there was quite the battle for the last couple of years. I to go back to your first point, for your talk about the kind of the history. I love the preface into the book about kind of the background and how it all started. So that's if anybody skimmed over that, that's a great segue into kind of the whole book and how it came about. So Tony, Dr. Nelman had to jump off. He was having some audio issues, but he's jumping back on now. So
Hey, well, great discussion. I don't want to beat a dead horse, but let's jump over to some other areas that at least popped out to me.
Yeah.
Please, if there is something that popped out, jump on, if not this week, in the next weeks, come up with some ideas of what you guys want to discuss for the chapters. But still in this introduction portion of chapter 1, I mean, the motto of a land surveyor is following in the footsteps. And there's a page 3 in the book, but it talks about according to decisions in reported decisions reported in court cases, surveyors in tracing old boundary lines are directed and obligated to follow the footsteps of the original surveyor. Therefore, it is essential that any surveyor who practices in the area of property or boundary identification has knowledge of the historical background of land surveys in general and the geographic area specifically, and that he or she know under which laws they are originally performed. And I that is land surveying. You start getting into some definitions here of land surveying in the next couple pages here, but that's just another spot that as I was reading through this popped out to me again, that's what we hear all the time, following in the footsteps. But what is following in the footsteps? And we talk about boundary retracement. We've got to understand how and what they did. So in the case of the one I'm dealing with right now, where it's a very obvious, the deeds don't fit occupation. I know this area, it's literally down the street from where I live right now. Like, if there was an area I knew the history of surveying, it's this one, right? And every property on this section line is an error. They're all shifted 20, 30, 40 feet, depending on some of the properties there. Oh yeah, it's an impressive one, but and everyone knows that the issue's there, right? Like, everyone agrees it's there, everyone sees it's there. They don't really care until someone new comes in, right? Some of these old farmers are starting to die off and sell their property and sell their farms, and all of a sudden someone comes in and there's a problem. So following in the footsteps, I can go out there as a professional surveyor. I can follow the footsteps really easy. I see where they screwed up. I see how it happened, and we can have that discussion. So I just, again, let's use this as a talking point, following the footsteps and definition of surveying, part 1.2, definition of surveys and surveyors. Anything anyone wants to add in there?
While waiting for people to chime in, Joanne, Gary did promise me he's going to be jumping in on Wisdom Wednesdays when he has time. But to go back to your point about the art of retracement, I mean, that's the whole thing that Gary talks about, following in the footprints and the retracement side of the whole thing. So Gary will jump on, and he just didn't have time today, but he will be here. Anybody want to kind of chime in on Trent's topic there? Good stuff.
Sean, since you wrote it in the comments here, I'm going to call you out. Do you want to jump on and talk about, he says, I've been taught recently from PLSs in my office to write a narrative of how you come up with your boundary decisions and what you held. Do you mind sharing, Sean, some of their wisdom and how they taught that to you and how you approach it?
He's
Yeah.
not.
Question for?
It was for Sean. Yeah, Sean. I was gonna
Sean.
say Sean's not shy. He's good. Come on.
Yeah. So, these guys were explaining to me that it's our objective to kind of explain what we did. It's not good enough to just put numbers and distances and bearings on a map, that you have to explain what you did and how you kind of got to your solution. So I'm kind of seeing a different side of things, and it's been really helpful.
That's awesome.
Yep.
Would you, I was gonna say, back to like Tony's point, where if anybody does surveyors reports, would anybody be willing to like email them to us and we can kind of share samples of that kind of stuff? Go for it, John.
I'm sorry. So one of the things that I was also noting, similar to Sean, is that too many of surveyors depend upon the bearings and distances to explain their boundary, and that's good if you only have one reference, like a GLO map, where it's very easy to see the relationship. But when you have multiple references, and I've had one map that was up to 26 references, it's hard for anybody to read. And as Trent was saying, it's like you want this to be able, every map should be able to go out and go to a court and be defendable, and to be easy to explain to a judge or a jury what's going on. So I always tell surveyors is, tell me how you defined, how you determined the north line, how you determine the west line, the east line, the south line, because they all may be different. You know, you might be splitting in improvements on a street on the west line, but you might have found monuments along a street on the north line. Or you might have found lines of occupation by an old stone wall on the east line. You know, explain this. And, you know, I've had one surveyor that had a sheet that was, you know, standard 18 by 26 in the state of California, and 2/3 of that sheet was just a narrative going, you know, on. I mean, there must have been over, you know, 2,000 words on that sheet just to explain what happened. It was very well done, and people could follow it. But we don't do that enough as surveyors.
Yeah, I'm surprised that surveyors don't really author like full paragraph style papers on their boundaries. Like, I guess you don't want to hire me for every survey, because it'd be like, you know, way too much time involved in this lot survey. I understand the economics, but, you know, whenever I do a boundary survey, and I do maybe 6 or 8 per year, I do between a, I don't know, 15 to 30 page narrative with maybe a few hundred pages of attachments. I had one survey in Palm Beach, like 2,000 pages of attachments. And it's because the county surveyor was actually tearing up original GLO corners and putting his own stuff in different places. So you have like 2 entirely different Palm Beach systems. But anyways, you know, I feel like in order to explain how I resolve my boundaries, I have to write it in different sections. You know, what was the record research? What was the found evidence? What was the analysis? What were the principles? I have a lot of cases and statutes I cite. So it drives me crazy when I get a survey in and they make this big determination. You know, this is like a, you know, the entire issue. And then there's no explanation about how they did it. Like, why did you pick these corners? Anything, just one sentence would be enough.
Yeah, you know, we hear, you know, deeds taker or fence taker, right? And I'm both, right? You look at all the levels of evidence and choose it, and you got to explain how you get there. There's been a lot of chat going on. Let's see if there's any. I'm trying to keep up with it here, see if there's anything to really kind of call out to those that can't see the chat.
Yeah, I was actually about to call out Rodney on the Indiana thing because I thought they had to do a thing, but he threw it in the chat. So administrative code requires a surveyor's report for every boundary performed.
Rodney, what does that report look like? I've surveyed in Indiana, but I've never surveyed in Indiana. So
it's that's a good question. They look different. I was provided a survey by a client 2 weeks ago, and I was almost embarrassed to receive it because now I have to rely on that survey to perform the work that I need to do for a development, or will be involved in doing a development. Sometimes, depending on the project, the lots could, or the surveys could be, for a lot survey, it could be just a single page report, pretty simple. But to Trent's point of every survey being defendable, it goes into how big is the survey and how much that information on the plat has to be shown and should be shown to make it retraceable. Trent also said, Gary, is going to try to make it to these things. I took my boundary law from Gary Kent, starting in the late 90s. So the first survey job I had, I learned from a guy that was preaching what we call Rule 12 in Indiana. That's what I learned from. So I never knew anything different than following the footsteps of the surveyor. And for that it made my job, and getting licensed, fairly easy compared to, a lot of the things I see across the nation. We have our surveys, projects I do are usually transportation surveys, and I do a lot of route surveys that also require a report. And some of those reports, they fill up 1 or 2 24 by 36 page, sheets for plans. So they can be extremely extensive, retracing a route of 5 or 6 miles where you have, maybe 20 or 30 section corners that you're recovering and defending, the evidence. So
Okay, I think we get fairly lengthy. Go for it, Rich.
Okay, just a couple of things I've been thinking about, the concept of the narrative and the survey report. It's kind of a continuum from the memo to the file to the formal report that you might submit if it's either required in your state or you may be putting in as part of some other, if it's going into litigation or something. But what I find the narrative, when all the stuff is fresh in my head and I'm just finishing up, is I kind of do it Jack Kerouac style on like a scroll, and I just stream of consciousness, go around my plan, write down all the little things. Oh, I looked at this, I looked at that didn't check, somebody, whatever it is. And where that comes in handy is when you get that call 10 years later from someone working next to you, and they say, I got a question or whatever. You can pull out your poorly written run-on sentence narrative that's in your file, and you can, when you look at it and they say, well, why did you do this? And you go, yeah, why did I do that? Well, then you can look at your own narrative and go, oh yeah, I don't remember every little thing from every survey I did 10 years ago. But when I read that memo, it's like, oh yeah, that's right. The neighbor came out and gave me that thing. And this is, and not all of those little details can make it to your final plat. I mean, we want to make sure that someone looking at it, can see that we made a very conscious decision of boundary decisions and the key pieces are there. But on some, you can't make a simple plat of a complex survey, and you can't always take all the information, especially where I'm at, where we might have 200 or 300 years worth of deeds and documents. We can't note every consistency or every little thing that we do, but I can capture those in my narrative if they don't necessarily always make it to the plat. So again, I think always something going into your file to refresh your memory is a good tip.
Even just on that point too, great points, but even just a text box, right, in CAD, just off to the side of the drawing where it's not in any viewport, just put your thoughts down, right? Do a brain dump really quick before you do something. That's just as good. Yeah.
And I find the older I get, the more important that becomes.
Yeah, of course, of course. Go for it, John.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, I kind of, myself, I look at the narrative and what Rich is talking about, your file memo, and a report as three completely different things with three different purposes. The report, like Rich is talking about, is there to refresh your memory when you get that phone call from somebody 10 years from now and give you, the highlights of the details, but not really getting into the meat of the details like you would in a full report.
Right.
I look at a report as one that's required by the court. They have in Rule 26, which is the disclosure rules in the Rules of Civil Procedure. The Rule 26 report is a report that's requested by one of the parties that is your full-on explanation of everything you looked at, everything you did, how you considered the evidence, and a complete report, in the form of a narrative, but it's a full-on report that, like somebody said, I think it was Connie, that said, yeah, a couple thousand pages. It can be a few hundred pages. It could be 10 pages, depends.
Sure.
But, that's the Rule 26 report that really gets down to the meat. And then my narrative on the survey, what I'm looking at there is, and even with the survey itself, when you hand that survey to your client, they don't know, they still can't read it. They don't understand it. They look at the shape of it and says, yeah, it looks like my property. Yeah, I think that must be my house there. But they don't understand anything about it. They read the narrative and might as well be written in a foreign language, because it is to them.
Yep.
We write that narrative and we prepare that plat, not for the client, but for the future surveyor. When we put our survey file that in the public repository, those future surveyors going to go to that repository, pull your survey up, and go over it with a fine-tooth comb. And anything that's important that I can tell that surveyor in the narrative, even in a quick generic sentence or two, sometimes might be sufficient for them to say, oh, okay, yeah, I see they did this, I see they did this, and why they did this and that. And then if he still has a question after reading my narrative and looking at my map, he's obligated under the rules of ethic to our professional ethics to give me a call and ask. And I'll give him the details. I'll pull the memo out of the file. I'll go through the details and help them understand what I did and why.
Yeah. Good stuff.
Okay. No, I love this. This is what this is all about. It's got my brain thinking, even though I do narratives online, thinking about better ways of doing it, keeping my notes, I'm going to throw this question out here. What states, because I think I know the answer, but of those that are here, what states require a narrative? What states require the survey to actually be filed? And then throw in the chat also, where is it filed? Because that's different state to state too, right? In Utah, it's filed with the county surveyor, and it's not part of an official property record, right? Versus in the recorders or the register of deeds office, where it might be part of those official records. So Oregon requires a narrative.
Yeah,
Yep.
somebody is things. There's states that don't require it, right? Yeah, no, Nevada's a required record of survey state, and ours goes with the county recorder. So go for it, Joey.
Yeah, hey, I just you blew me away right now saying it's not in the recorder's office. So there's no constructive notice of that thing. I mean, it's just on the map, and only surveyors are expected to pick it up. Is that kind of the idea?
I mean, it's public record, right? Anyone can go into the surveyor's office and grab it, but like a title search, when they're looking at the abstract of the property, right? They're going to the recorder's office and they're looking at those documents, deeds and easements and whatnot. where they're not necessarily going to the surveyor's office to go pull a record of survey on that property.
That's a big difference. Go for it, Joey. Yeah.
Yeah, no, gotcha. That
Yeah.
it's just interesting to me. Well, you know, I don't believe they're required in any county here in California. I know they're not required at the state level, but I just assumed they would be recorded, so that's full notice for everybody. But yeah, interesting. Thank you. And I think they're a great idea. I wish we did them here. It's awesome.
Just even going back to that point though, like going to the title research, right? I mean, our record of surveys, they're a public record for every single thing. And so it shows up, a record of survey shows up on a title report. So you're saying a boundary, kind of a standard boundary survey outside of a parcel map or final map or anything doesn't show up in the public record for a title research?
Correct. And John can speak, probably he's more
go for it,
experienced in Utah than I am, but John's got your hand up. Correct me where I'm missing, but I don't generally see those in my title reports unless there's a specific purpose for it.
Yeah, and that is the case, and we actually did that on purpose when we passed the legislation for the Filing Act back in April of '88. It was the first time we started filing any private surveys in the state of Utah. It was in 1988, and the reason we did not want it to be constructive notice is simply because it is just an opinion of a surveyor as to the location of the boundaries. And should not be binding upon parties. It should not be binding upon subsequent purchasers, and it shouldn't be binding on subsequent surveyors. It's just an opinion, and it's an opinion that is subject to change through additional evidence or other things that may come up. And a surveyor can he go in and he can, upon discovery of new evidence, and changing an opinion, he can go in and modify the survey if he needs to. But we didn't want to make it anything that would show up as constructive notice and have the appearance of being binding upon parties. And that was primarily it. Now, I know in Montana, they file their surveys or record their surveys with the county recorder's office, and they're given an entry number and they're part of the title record. So they will show up in a title search. Our title companies here, in Utah, where it's not part of the public title record, they still look at them and may raise issues on them, but they're not really part of their constructive notice, and so they shouldn't be even showing up in the title reports. But some of the companies do pick up on them, but they are a public repository, and everybody knows they're there. It's just information that's available about your boundaries, and it's really a repository for the benefit of surveyors, not necessarily for the benefit of the public.
Wow. So
I'll just throw in there before John jumps in, but I'll just throw in there, the only time I see it in title report is on like a development type project where the developer is seeking a title report and provides a copy of my surveyor to the title company in their research. And then it's thrown on as also subject to some survey that Trent Williams may or may not have done and may or may not have filed and may or may not have any discrepancies on there. And that's kind of how they throw it on a title report.
Yeah. Kind of when you do an ALTA survey, that's what happens usually. With the ALTA survey, you get their title policy, you do your survey, and you've certified to that title company, and then they get your survey when it's done, and then they add to Schedule B Section 2 all of the things that are shown on your survey that they're taking exception to, that aren't shown in the public records. So they just use it as a blanket a way to get out of ensuring anything that might be shown on the correct survey.
Yeah.
So Scarpa's got his hand up here.
I was gonna say, so what's a correct survey? Just parcel map, final map type stuff? I mean, most places a record of surveys is just as good as anything else. Although we have a term that we use is soft lines or hard lines, I guess sometimes, but seems like a record of survey in Utah would be a quote unquote soft survey compared to, unless it's a final map or a parcel map or whatever, but that's interesting. Go for it, John.
So to add on to what Connie was saying, I was trying to jump in on saying the same thing, but in the state of California, constructive notice is based upon a public hearing. So a final map and a parcel map, final map being AKA a subdivision map in the state of California,
Yeah.
that is went to public hearing. So that is constructive notice according to the California State Board. That's their opinion. And so it's not so much that record of surveys, they don't provide, they're still filed in the same manner, but they do not provide constructive notice. And so as everybody's saying, it's the surveyor's opinion, but final maps are all, and parcel maps are also the surveyor's opinion about where the outside boundary is. But because of the public hearing, it implies constructive notice, and it will show up in the parcel maps, and final maps will show up in title reports, whereas record of surveys typically do not, unless they are referenced in a deed somehow, some way.
Gotcha. Yeah, great points.
I want Joey Waltz, jump on here. I want to know about this surveyors quit claiming a lot to a client, force the survey into title. Where are you at, Joey?
No, I'm in California. It's not a common thing. I heard it in passing at a conference probably 10 years ago. Someone said, oh yeah, like I know a guy who finishes a survey, quit claims it over to the client and puts his record of survey there. So all of a sudden now you've got a deed in the chain, and whoever pulls it sees the record of survey. So I think it's not a good idea.
That goes back to that disclaimer we talked about. That's awesome.
Well, we're about out of the hour. I just want to throw something else out here. This has been an awesome discussion. I think we've got a good base for what surveying is and what kind of our obligations are. I'm going to throw out one other example to kind of have us mull over and think about. So I spent almost 10 years surveying, got licensed in Wisconsin, and one of their statutes requires, if you do a retracement survey, right? The survey was done 15, 20, 30 years ago, and you do a retracement survey and you find all the corners in, a lot of people would consider, okay, I didn't set any corners, so I don't need to do a record of survey. I don't need to file anything because they're all in. In Wisconsin, they have some language in there that would say that you need to file an affidavit or a survey saying, I did one 20 years later and they're still in now, and for a while there's some surveyors that would take a copy of the plat or a record of survey that was done, and they would stamp someone else's work and PDF on top of that, or handwrite on top of that. Hey, I found all the corners in, I'm filing, this is my record of survey. So it's a kind of a double stamp. It's a really interesting situation where they're filing that or recording that as their record of survey. And there's a lot of heartache of recording someone else's stamp with yours because you're just copying a survey saying you found them in there. But to kind of finish out the chapter here, we look at the current need for surveyors. There's lots of discussions, and Trent has done such a great job. I really enjoyed the roundtable discussions at the Western Conference, a lot about the need for surveyors and how do we draw them in. I know the Utah Council of Land Surveyors is kind of doubling down on that right now. Our education committee is really looking at ways to bring more into the field. And the interesting thing I see is as we talk about what surveying is, we can have lots of really neat discussions. We can talk about those surveyors that are doing cool utility things and jumping out of helicopters on mountainsides or traversing to old original corners. But us few and proud and geeky, this is why we need surveyors. I really like the Get Kids Into Survey campaign where they're talking about a life without surveyors. All these things that we've been talking about today get, without surveyors offering our opinions or offering our expertise in understanding deeds and, and being able to read those and put those on the ground, there's a big risk for even added confusion. Right? There is an art to what we do, and the evidence that we look at to get to our final opinions, that's what the rest of this book kind of talks about. So chapter 2 defines scope and nature of evidence. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about in 2 weeks is now that we've kind of set this base for what is surveying, how are we doing in our states, what are those weird nuances, what is property rights versus property boundaries, and what are we actually doing. Now let's start looking at how do we make those opinions and determine it, and what evidence we have. So I would just encourage everyone to kind of think through, come prepared with some questions and some discussion points, and maybe even some of those really weird double GLO corners like Trent found of there's the evidence, and how do we choose one versus the other. And I'm excited for the next chapter. I appreciate everyone being here.
I just want to hit on the, so I just threw in the chat and I saw Rodney turn his camera on because it's in his beautiful home state of Indiana, but these are the problems that are going to start arising. These kind of articles are what is going to really start to push. And that's kind of what I preach on. Like if a developer cannot get his work done, and he's got to wait months and months and months to get something done, they're the ones that are going to go to the lobbyists. Those are the ones that are going to start asking for the changes because we as surveyors can't get the work done. I mean, you listen to everybody across the country, right? And even the article talks about, he's got survey friends in Indiana that they're booked out for the next year. And so if we don't continue to push the profession and bring new blood in, and my numbers, roughly, we need around 1,500 a year taking the exam. If you look at the latest NCS squared reports, there's 596 that sat for the PS exam. 68% of them passed. There was a few retakers. Put all those numbers together, and it's like 478 people passed the PS exam in 2021. And so that's a net loss of 1,000 right there, just in 12 months. And those are some rollover numbers from 2020 as well. So, we're losing faster, which everybody knows. We're preaching to the choir. But just to put into perspective, a net loss of 1,000 in 1 year, we're only going to have bigger issues. And these articles that are coming out, like the one today in Indiana, are only going to become more relevant. And the squeaky wheel gets the oil, right? And so we definitely need to be proactive. John, you had your hand up. Go for it.
Yeah, I haven't read the article that you have up, but to add on to what you're saying, in the state of California, prior to 1982, civil engineers were allowed to practice land surveying, and that area is dwindling. But a lot of engineers around the state are now pushing to be reinstated as land surveyors. And I've addressed a lot of them at local associations for engineering firms. And I said, I'm okay with you guys being able to practice land surveying if you are competent as land surveyors. And I asked simply, I said, what was the difference between NGVD 29 and NBD 88? And only one person out of 30 engineers knew the difference, but couldn't really explain it in any detail. And so, that's the scary part. And that's where, at least in the state of California, the engineers are pushing to get back in, but are they competent? Are they the team that we want to have, playing with us? And so, they're very smart people, but, are they ready to, be on the first string team?
Well, to that point, right, John, how many is civil engineering programs in the country, one, no longer offer or require a surveying class to even get their 4-year degree, right? And then ABED recently removed the requirement for having a surveying class as part of the curriculum for civil engineering. And so where are they getting the education to survey to become surveyors, right? And so, Connie, you had your hand up. Go for it.
Oh, yeah, no. The engineers' understanding of surveying right now is the bane of my existence at the moment, or in recent years, because it's especially with the younger generations of the surveyors, of the engineers, it is difficult to even have a conversation about surveying concepts because they just have not been exposed to it. So sometimes I deal with a contract that's issued where I'm they're requiring me to do a boundary base map of assessor's map, and they want to do a right-of-way takes off of it, or just the difference between the title and the boundary line, and why certain things can't be done, to a point where, you know, we have to have arguments about, I don't want to lose my license over this. I think education for engineers, survey education for engineers would be a very good thing to have more competence.
Yeah, for sure. Go for it, John.
So one last thing on this, what we do is we hire civil engineering interns, and we have them out in the field. They are basically our equivalent of rodman chainmen. We have them in the office learning how to process corner records. Excuse me, excuse the fire assembly parade down my street. But, you know, we get the civil engineers interns to be a part of our program, and they learn, and so they have some good fundamentals, even though they may not be getting, you know, our local college has a Survey 101 course, but it's, you know, book related, whereas here now they get really hands-on, and so they really understand, and so they will have much more appreciation of the survey profession when they get out and really start practicing engineering.
Yeah, no, it's great. But then, yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's. I mean, I'm with, you know, you guys. If civil engineers have to go through the same testing procedures that we do as licensed surveyors, and they can prove their competence and prove their stuff, then there's no problems. But if it's just a blanket, you know, swap your license, now a CE can start performing surveying, that's part of the problem, right? So I don't mind, you know, like they say, Wyoming has dual requirements, and, you know, anybody can become a PE and an LS in Nevada, but you got to pass both exams. And so, yeah. Left that. What else? Anything else you got to add, Trent? We're gonna probably keep them close to like the mentoring, right around 90 minutes or so. So I know we're sitting right at about an hour and 15, but we can always go down lots of rabbit holes to have lots of conversations. But
I think this has been great discussion. This is a shorter chapter as far as this book goes.
For sure.
So
Yeah. And that would be,
I don't have anything else to add at this point.
I would say, you know, for those watching afterwards, because this goes up on Wisdom Wednesday's website, and so people will view it just like Mentoring Mondays. But for those that didn't, you didn't see it? Sorry, Rodney. For those of you that are watching this afterwards, right, I would say just kind of stick with this. You know, chapter 1 is, again, just the introductions, and we had a great introduction today, but the rest of these chapters moving forward will be where it really starts to get juicy. Go for it, Joey.
Yeah, so I have so many on here, Trent, and many of you have the 3rd edition of this book. I have the 5th, but I've heard a few people say that the 3rd edition is kind of the one of the kind of better ones, and I wondered if anyone can explain that, if that's true, or is it more like I like the 5th because this is the one with my notes in it from school. So, but I wonder if anyone else has heard that same sentiment, that the 3rd edition is really, really good.
Yeah, I couldn't tell you I've heard that one either. If anybody didn't, go for it, Rich.
Yeah, there was a big change between, I think it was 3 and 4. And a lot, if you look, I used the 2 in school, and there was a huge difference. And I think it was between, it was between 3 and 4 that they made a major change, and they took a lot out of the book, but then they added in, the way they did it was more like boundary control. And all the stuff that came out of the first few editions, Don Wilson then put into his book, Interpreting Land Records. So that's what, like, the big difference you see as you go. I think it's been from 3 to 4 is the big change. If you look at the older ones, it's all in interpreting. I mean, I sat and I've talked to Don about it, and that's exactly what he did. And that's an awesome book. Actually, Bob Moynihan stopped teaching out of boundary control and legal principles and moved to the interpreting land records as soon as it came out.
Nice.
Because it's got some really cool stuff in it. It's a good complement to evidence and procedure.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
Joseph's got his hand up here, and then I got one thing to throw out too.
Go for it. Go for it, Dr. Bobby.
Regarding editions, I cannot speak about this book because I haven't referred to the older edition, to the new edition, because I don't have it. And I can't remember how many changes I've seen as it went through 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th. But I know with the other book, the boundary location book, what I found is that, at least in the 7th edition, that what Robillard and Wilson added, it's too bad Tony isn't on here anymore, but what Robillard and Wilson added are almost identifiable. In other words, you can actually see different styles of writing. And sometimes it's a little disconnected and hard to follow. I find that I need to guide my students a little bit on how to read the 7th edition of that version. So I'm looking forward to finding out how this one reads and how smooth it is in terms of being seamless.
Yeah, nice. Good stuff.
I'm going to throw this in the chat here too, but if you're listening, after watching this afterwards or preparing for the next one, let's maybe just plug in the Facebook page for Wisdom Wednesdays for the land surveying profession.
Yep.
Let's get those questions so we can start that discussion. Or if you missed this discussion, throw them on there, and we can, utilize this expert panel here to kind of continue on and help answer things that we may not have hit on this.
Perfect. Yeah, lots of you going through the FS and the PS right now. That's awesome. I will say there's some names that have not jumped on Mentoring Mondays, I think, though. Some of these names look new. But love it. Anybody else want to chime in? I know it's these times are always tough. At least Wednesdays are a little better, but it's still dinner time for somebody somewhere. That's awesome. Except for us on the West Coast. It's just now getting to be 5 o'clock. So
yeah,
love it.
I would encourage our younger counterparts or earlier in their careers to participate and talk. Don't let don't let the old timers have the microphone the whole time, because sometimes the expert advice and the expert level information doesn't reach the younger surveyors quite. They end up feeling excluded. So, and since we got on the topic of younger surveyors and bringing people in, one of the chronic things that I've experienced, at least within California, the surveyors associations, is that everything is so LS focused that a lot of younger people feel lost as far as how they can contribute or participate until they get the license. So there's this big gap that I think we need to be a little more inclusive of our technicians and youngsters. And
yeah, I agree, absolutely. Which is why I love between both of these programs, we end up with such a great diverse mixture of people. So it's very cool.
In November, the UCLS does our field forum, which is our alternate to the the professional conference. That's geared towards our field guys. Trent presented last year, did a great job. But I get exactly what you're saying, Connie. As a young surveyor, sitting through a conference, and I love our old mentors here, but when they're pulling up this really, really rare BLM case, and look how unique and rare this is, I get it now and I like them, but as a young guy, that wasn't dealing with those really cool things on a regular basis, doing more lot surveys and instructions taking as it is when you start out, I didn't connect with it. Right, it was way over my head.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I spent a few years feeling lost.
And that's the same for even college students. I mean,
Mhm.
you know, it's overwhelming in what you're learning so fast. There's so much to learn, and it's so compressed as a college student, right? I mean, you don't start learning real life stuff until you get onto the job. So I totally agree. It's intimidating for sure. Go for it, John.
Yeah, I was going to add that, like, just launching off of what Connie's talking about there, that one of the things in my case that made the biggest difference in my entire career as a surveyor was that I had a boss that it was just not even questioned that every workshop, every convention, every thing that was every monthly luncheon or anything that was going on in the profession, we were there.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, well, this Wednesday at noon, we got to go have a luncheon and we're going to be for a couple hours. Nobody's going to be working because we're all going to be here.
Yeah.
Or we're going to be gone for the next 3-4 days because we're all going to a conference. And so I just kind of thought that's the way everybody was doing it, was that they were kind of raising up the younger generation. And I think that really falls on us as the mentors of the profession to make sure that our people are coming to those things, that they're invited and that they're expected to show up and they're expected to be there and learn stuff. And it's part of the discussion when everybody comes back to the office as to different things that they learned or whatnot. And what about this? And well, did you get that guy? And that was sort of a wacky idea, but hey, at least there's some ongoing discussion.
Yeah.
But it's such a learning opportunity that is just vital to being properly raised up in the profession and to become interested, to maintain our interest in the profession and continue that as a norm. So I would encourage all of us as mentors to make sure that we're paying for our people to go to those conferences. They're important. They need to be there.
Yeah, for sure. So the Western Conference we just had here, I had 13 of my 31 employees all at the conference the entire time, right? It's just something you have to do. And then to that same point, it goes back to, we just had Gary Kent on a couple of weeks ago for leadership. And so it goes back to leadership styles and servant leaderships and different things that we need to promote from the overall top part of the profession that needs to trickle down. And so those kind of leaderships and those things that are what we need to promote as well. Go for it, John.
Yeah, and to add on to what Stahl and Trent, what you're saying is, I mean, the conferences and seminars are great and you learn a lot from that, but it's after the official conference has ended at 5 o'clock or the seminar has ended. Exactly. That's where everything really starts. That's where the one-on-one conversations go.
100%.
I mean, I've talked to people till 1 and 2 o'clock in the morning, just because it's, you're just talking about what are you doing in your area? What are you doing about this situation? How do we move this legislation forward?
Yep.
That's where real surveyors make progress in learning and moving our profession forward.
Heck yeah. Great point, John. Yeah, no, those hospitality suites is where the end of the thing after 5 o'clock, like you say, the dinners and the hospitality suites and that kind of stuff is, and it's great that, we have all at least here on the West Side, where we have all the young surveyors come and they're volunteers and, we bring them up to the hospitality suite. And so some of those college students are getting a lot of that interaction and a lot of that good, juicy stuff, as we say in the, getting it out of the hospitality suite. So great stuff.
And encouraging them and allowing them to get involved at the state societies too, because that's what's going to make the difference. My complaint about, I think this was before we kind of started, right? Is, you've got most state societies have the older people that can dedicate the time, right? They're in a spot in their career where they can spend the time to run the state societies and volunteer those hours. And we need to get the younger guys in there and active in it. So that just becomes natural to them.
Exactly. Start it young. Start the networking young. It's the best thing for your career, is having the network and the diverse backgrounds to have those conversations and to have the friends within the network. I mean, we can I can point out to Rodney, but one of the Nolan Mark in Indiana, right? His equipment breaks, and by having friends in the profession and networking and having those relationships, Rodney's able to loan him an extra gun that's sitting around for a week. I mean, those are the kind of things that when you build those friends and those relationships that you can rely on, that make the profession that much better. So it's great stuff. Anybody else, or we want to kind of end on that? I love leadership, and Surveying Leadership is actually an article that I'm going to be trying to do this summer for the next Travers. I'm also the editor of our Nevada publication, so you can check out those. There's a lot of good stuff there, but that's one of my articles this summer that I'm going to tackle is Surveying Leadership and how we can definitely bring it to the survey profession, because it needs to be brought forward.
For those who missed it, your mentoring Monday about leadership was amazing.
It was good. Yeah, Gary did it from his car. He was in San Diego on vacation, waiting. His granddaughter was playing golf, but in true Gary Kent fashion, he sat in the car in the parking lot and ran through with mentoring Mondays with us. And he's a true sport. He's a icon for our profession, and we all appreciate him for that. So I think we'll end it with that, and then we'll be back 2 weeks. So the 24th, Wednesday, and to start to dig into some of the good stuff. I appreciate everybody's time. It was great.
Thanks to everybody.
Great for your input and great content tonight. So we will have a good night.
This is an excellent.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, all.
I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Have a good night, guys.
Good night.